There's a video on YouTube that has been viewed millions of times. It's not a music video. It's not a tutorial or a comedy sketch. It's 10 hours of gentle rain falling on the streets of Cleveland, Ohio. Soft, rhythmic, soothing. The kind of ambient sound people play to help them fall asleep or focus while they study. Except this particular video has a title that should make sleep impossible. Cleveland Torso Murders Ambience. Rain sounds for relaxation and study. Let that sink in for a moment. Millions of people, right now, in cities across the world, are putting on their headphones, closing their eyes, and letting the simulated rain sounds of a city where a serial killer dismembered at least 12 human beings wash over them like a lullaby. They're seeking comfort in the atmospheric recreation of streets where body parts were discovered in piles, where a murderer so skilled with a blade that some suspected he had surgical training was never identified, never caught, never stopped. He simply faded into history, leaving behind only pieces of people and a detective's broken career. This is where we are now. This is what the internet has done to horror. It has turned unspeakable tragedy into aesthetic. The Cleveland Torso murders, also known as the Kingsbury Run murders, represent one of America's most disturbing unsolved cases, a string of brutal killings that terrorized Cleveland during the 1930s. And now, decades later, that terror has been repackaged as white noise for the algorithm generation. But here's the question we need to ask, the question that sits at the heart of this entire phenomenon. Why? Why are we drawn to this? What is it about the intersection of horror and comfort, of violence and relaxation, that speaks to something deep in our modern psyche? Why do we want to fall asleep to the rain falling on streets where a killer once hunted? To understand that, we need to go back to Cleveland, back to Kingsbury Run, back to September 23, 1935, when two boys were walking along the marshy banks of Kingsbury Run, a grimy industrial wasteland on Cleveland's east side, looking for scrap metal and driftwood. The run was a polluted creek bed that cut through the city like a scar, surrounded by hobo camps and factories, by rail yards and oil refineries. It was a place where the desperate and the invisible gathered, where the Great Depression had concentrated people who had fallen through every safety net society pretended to offer. The boys were climbing up an embankment, probably laughing, probably not thinking about much beyond what they might find to sell or trade, when one of them saw something pale in the weeds about 30 feet up the hill. At first they thought it might be a piece of mannequin. The color was wrong for living flesh. Too white, too waxy. But as they got closer, the details began to resolve into something that would live in their nightmares forever. It was a torso. Just a torso. No head. No arms. No legs. The skin had been carefully, almost professionally cleaned. The dismemberment cuts were precise, confident, the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The genitals had been removed. This wasn't a body. This was a message, though no one could read what it said. Within hours, police had arrived and begun searching the surrounding area. They found more pieces. Another torso, this one also male, about 30 feet away from the first. Then a collection of internal organs, neatly separated and placed in a pile. No heads. No hands. No way to identify who these people had been in life. They had been systematically erased, reduced to anonymous meat. And this was only the beginning. The rain fell on Kingsbury Run in sheets that turned the dust to mud and drummed hollow percussion on the roofs of makeshift shelters. If you stood at the eastern edge of Cleveland in 1935 and looked down into that ravine, you would see a geography that seemed designed for forgetting. The gully stretched 3 miles through the industrial heart of the city, a natural scar in the landscape that had become something far worse than nature ever intended. Kingsbury Run was not always a place of darkness. Once, it had been simply a creek valley, unremarkable in every way except for its depth and its steady descent toward the Cuyahoga River. But the 20th century transformed it. Factories rose along its edges like iron sentinels. The rail lines came next, cutting through the ravine and parallel tracks that carried freight and passengers, coal and steel. The commerce of a city that believed itself invincible. By the time the Great Depression struck, Kingsbury Run had become a corridor of industry, where the air tasted of metal and chemical smoke, where the soil itself was stained black with decades of industrial runoff. The Depression changed everything about Cleveland. In 1929, when the stock market collapsed and the economic foundations of America crumbled, Cleveland had been a prosperous place, a city of nearly 900,000 souls who believed in progress and paycheck. Within 3 years, that belief had been shattered. Factories that once ran 3 shifts reduced to 1, then closed entirely. Men who had been machinists and steel workers and rail yard laborers found themselves with nowhere to go and no money to get there. The unemployment rate in Cleveland climbed to 25%, then 30%, then higher, still in some neighborhoods. Families lost their homes. The social fabric began to tear. And when people lost everything, when they had nowhere else to turn, many of them descended into Kingsbury Run. The shantytowns grew organically, without plan or permission. They sprouted in the hidden corners of the ravine, in the spaces between the rail lines and the factories, in the shadows where the respectable city preferred not to look. The homeless built their shelters from whatever materials the industrial landscape provided. Sheets of corrugated metal became roofs and walls. Wooden crates that had carried machine parts were dismantled and repurposed. Canvas tarps, stolen or scavenged, provided insulation against the wind. The lucky ones found railroad boxcars that had been abandoned on dead-end sidings and claimed them as residences, tiny moving homes that would never move again. The geography of Kingsbury Run made it perfect for this invisible population. The ravine was deep enough that someone standing on the street level above might never know that dozens, sometimes hundreds of people lived below. The slopes were steep and thick with vegetation, weeds and wild grasses that grew tall in the polluted soil. Scrubbed trees and thorn bushes created natural walls that blocked sightlines. A person could descend 30 feet down into the run and vanish completely from the city above. 3 main rail lines crossed through the area. The New York Central, the Nickel Plate Road, and the Baltimore and Ohio all sent trains through Kingsbury Run day and night. These trains brought transients, men who rode the rails looking for work that no longer existed anywhere. They would jump off the slow-moving freight cars as they passed through the ravine, adding to the temporary population of the shantytowns. Then they would disappear again, hopping another train to another city, always moving, always hoping the next place would be better. This constant flow of anonymous faces made Kingsbury Run unique in Cleveland. In the neighborhoods above, people knew their neighbors, recognized faces, noticed when someone went missing. But in the Run, anonymity was the default condition. No one kept census records of the shantytown populations. No one knew who arrived or who left. A person could be there one day and gone the next, and no one would think to ask why. This anonymity was survival for some, freedom from judgment and questions for others. But it also created vulnerability that would prove fatal. The soundscape of 1930s Kingsbury Run was a symphony of industry and poverty. Factory whistles marked the passage of time, their sharp blasts cutting through the air at shift changes, a reminder that somewhere above, people still had jobs, still had routines, still had normal lives. The trains were constant. The coupling of rail cars produced sharp metallic crashes that echoed through the ravine at all hours. Steel wheels on steel rails created a rhythmic clatter that became white noise to anyone who lived there long enough. Steam locomotives huffed and wheezed, their breathing mechanical and endless. When it rained, the sounds changed. Water on corrugated metal roofs created cascades of percussion, each improvised shelter producing its own rhythm depending on the angle of the roof, the gauge of the metal, the intensity of the rainfall. Canvas tarps drummed differently, a softer, more muffled sound. The rain turned the paths through the shantytown into rivers of mud that sucked at shoes and made walking treacherous. Water collected in pools where industrial debris blocked natural drainage, creating toxic puddles that reflected the gray sky. There is something oddly intimate about these sounds when we imagine them now. The rain on metal, the distant train whistles, even the industrial background noise have been stripped of their context and repackaged as comfort. Modern ASR enthusiasts seek out recordings of rain on tin roofs, finding in them a sense of safety and nostalgia. The sounds that once marked poverty and desperation have been transformed into tools for relaxation, divorced from their history. But in Kingsbury Run in the 1930s, These sounds meant something very different. The rain on your roof meant your shelter was at least waterproof for now, but it also meant the cold was seeping in, that hypothermia was a real possibility, that tomorrow the ground would be even more treacherous. The train whistles meant possible escape or possible danger, depending on whether you were trying to leave or trying to hide. The people of the shanty towns were diverse in background, but united in circumstance. There were men who had once been skilled tradesmen, now reduced to selling scrap metal they scavenged from the industrial debris that littered the ravine. There were veterans of the Great War who had returned home to find no home waiting, who carried their trauma into this landscape that mirrored their internal chaos. There were alcoholics for whom the shantytown offered judgment-free access to bootleg liquor and industrial alcohol that could blind or kill. There were women too, though fewer, some with children, trying to maintain some semblance of domestic life in shelters built from garbage. The neglect was systematic. City services did not extend into Kingsbury Run. Police rarely patrolled there, and when they did, it was to rouse troublemakers, not to provide protection. No one collected garbage because everything was already garbage. No one maintained the paths because the paths were not supposed to exist. The people of the shantytown were invisible to official Cleveland, acknowledged only when they became a problem, when fires spread from their makeshift stoves, or when someone died and the body needed to be removed. The ravine itself was a dumping ground long before bodies were found there. Factories dumped chemical waste into the creek that still flowed intermittently through the run. Construction debris from projects all over Cleveland found its way there. People threw their household trash down the slopes, reasoning that no one would care, and they were right. The earth was poisoned, the water undrinkable, the air thick with the smell of decay and industrial processes. This combination of factors, geographic isolation, transient population, official neglect, created what would become a hunting ground. The killer, whoever he was, understood that Kingsbury Run offered him everything he needed. Victims who would not be missed. Locations where he could work undisturbed. Terrain where bodies could be left and might not be discovered for days, weeks, or at all. The very features that made the run a refuge for the desperate made it a workshop for the murderous. The irony is brutal. The people who descended into Kingsbury Run were already victims of economic violence, of a system that had failed them, of circumstances beyond their control. They were trying to survive in the margins of a city that had turned its back on them. And there, in that place of last resort, they encountered a different kind of predator, one who understood that society's outcasts made perfect prey precisely because they had already been discarded. When we listen now to recordings of rain falling on metal roofs, when we seek out the sounds of distant trains and industrial ambience for relaxation, we are tapping into something profound. These sounds carry memory, even if we do not consciously recognize it. They speak to shelter and danger simultaneously, to human resilience and human cruelty, to the landscapes where both poverty and violence found fertile ground. The soundscape of Kingsbury Run in the 1930s was not soothing. It was the soundtrack to survival, to fear, to lives lived on the absolute edge. But it was also undeniably human, the sounds of people making do, creating community in impossible circumstances, persisting against everything that worked to erase them. That persistence makes what happened there all the more terrible, because it happened to people who were already fighting just to exist. September of 1935 brought an ending to the summer heat along the shores of Lake Erie, where the water turned cold and gray under autumn skies. It was on the 23rd of that month when a young man named Frank Lagasse made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was walking along the rocky beach at East 55th Street in Cleveland, a stretch of shoreline where debris regularly washed up from the lake's restless currents. Among the driftwood and refuse that morning, something pale caught his eye. Something that his mind initially refused to recognize as human. What Lagasse found was the lower half of a woman's torso, severed cleanly at the waist and at the knees. The flesh was waxy and strange, treated with some kind of chemical that gave it an unnatural pallor. The precision of the cuts immediately suggested someone with intimate knowledge of human anatomy, someone who had taken their time, who had approached this terrible work with the cool deliberation of a surgeon preparing a specimen. There was no blood. The body had been drained completely, leaving only the empty vessel of what had once been a living person. Within hours, the Cleveland Police Department descended upon the beach. Detective Orley May was among the first investigators to arrive, and he would later describe the scene as something that belonged in a medical examiner's laboratory, rather than on a public shoreline. The dismemberment showed what could only be called expertise. The joints had been disarticulated with knowledge of exactly where to cut, following the natural divisions of the body with surgical accuracy. This was not the frenzied hacking of a madman overcome with passion or rage. This was methodical. This was practice. This was someone who knew what they were doing. 2 weeks later, on October 8th, more pieces of the same body emerged from the lake. A torso's upper portion, again bisected with that same disturbing precision, washed ashore roughly a mile from where the first discovery had been made. The lake had kept its secrets for a time, before surrendering them piecemeal to the living world. But the head never appeared. The hands never surfaced. Those parts that might have given this woman back her name, her identity, her humanity, remained missing. Without fingerprints to check against criminal records or employment files, without dental records that might match to a dentist's charts, without a face that someone might recognize from a photograph, she became simply the Lady of the Lake. A designation, a case number, not a person anymore, but evidence. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy, Dr. Arthur Pierce, noted details that made the investigating detectives exchange uneasy glances. The chemical treatment of the flesh suggested someone trying to prevent decomposition, or perhaps attempting to destroy identifying marks or scars. The complete exsanguination, the total draining of blood from the body, indicated the victim had been hung upside down while still alive or immediately after death, allowed to bleed out completely in a manner used by butchers or by those in slaughterhouses. The torso showed no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, nothing to suggest the victim had fought against what was happening. Either death had come quickly and unexpectedly, or the woman had been rendered unconscious before the butchery began. What horrified the investigators most profoundly was not merely the killing itself, terrible as that was, but the care taken afterward. This was not disposal. This was presentation. The killer had spent time with the body, treating it with chemicals, performing their precise dismemberment, carefully removing any means of identification. The amount of time this would require, the level of anatomical knowledge necessary, the sheer cold-bloodedness of the process. All of it pointed towards something deeply wrong, something that went beyond ordinary human evil into territory that felt almost incomprehensible. Detective May and his partner, Detective Emil Musil, began constructing theories. Perhaps the killer was a doctor, someone with medical training who had access to the tools and knowledge required for such work. Perhaps a medical student, someone learning anatomy who had become fascinated with death in ways that twisted beyond academic interest. Perhaps a butcher, someone accustomed to rendering animal carcasses who had decided to apply those skills to human subjects. Perhaps someone who worked in a morgue or a funeral home. Someone already comfortable with death and dismemberment as part of their daily routine. The missing head and hands suggested someone who understood police procedure, who knew that identification would be the first priority for investigators, and who had deliberately made that identification impossible. This showed planning. This showed intelligence. This showed someone thinking several steps ahead, someone who wanted to commit the perfect crime, who wanted to reduce a human being to an unsolvable mystery. As investigators canvassed the area around where the body parts had been discovered, they began hearing stories that made their investigation more complicated. Other bodies had been found earlier that summer, they learned. In September of the previous year, 1934, the lower torso of another woman had washed up on the same stretch of Lake Erie Beach. That case had been written off as a possible industrial accident, perhaps someone who had fallen into machinery at one of the factories that lined the Cuyahoga River. In June of 1934, partial remains of another victim had been found in the Kingsbury Run area, a tangle of railroad tracks and homeless encampments that cut through Cleveland's industrial district. Those remains had been so badly decomposed that they merited barely a mention in the police files. Now, looking back with the benefit of hindsight and with the chilling evidence of the Lady of the Lake before them, the detectives began to wonder if they were dealing not with a single murder, but with a series. The thought that someone might have been killing and dismembering victims for over a year without anyone recognizing the pattern sent a cold dread through the investigation team. How many others might there be? How many people had disappeared into whatever place this killer used as their workshop, and never emerged? The newspapers seized upon the story with the hunger that only truly sensational crimes can inspire. The Cleveland press ran headlines screaming about the torso killer, a name that would stick as more victims came to light. The Plain Dealer published artist sketches of what the victim might have looked like, based on the torso's measurements and the medical examiner's estimates of her age and build. She had been between 25 and 30 years old, relatively short, with reddish-brown hair on what remained of her body. She might have weighed around 115 pounds when alive. She might have been someone's daughter, someone's sister, perhaps someone's mother. But without her face, without her hands, without her identity, she existed only as might-have-beens and speculation. The public reaction mixed horror with a kind of morbid fascination. Crowds gathered at the beach where the remains had been found, gawking at the spot as though expecting to find some visible trace of the violence that had occurred. Women clutched their purses closer when walking alone. Mothers called their daughters home earlier in the evening. The idea that someone could be abducted, murdered, methodically dismembered, and rendered forever nameless struck at something fundamental in the human psyche. We are our names. We are our faces. We are the marks we leave on the world, and the memories we create in others. To be reduced to a case number, to become merely evidence of someone else's depravity, represented a kind of annihilation that went beyond physical death. Detective May found himself lying awake at night, thinking about those missing pieces. Where was her head right now? Had the killer kept it, preserved it somehow as a trophy? Had it been weighted down and thrown into the deepest part of Lake Erie where it would never be found? Had it been destroyed, burned, or buried, or dissolved in chemicals? The same questions applied to the hands. Without those crucial pieces, the woman remained forever silenced, forever anonymous, forever reduced to the clinical language of autopsy reports and evidence log. The investigation expanded outward in every direction. Police checked missing persons reports, but in 1935, many people simply disappeared without anyone filing official paperwork. The Great Depression had sent thousands wandering in search of work, had separated families, had created a vast population of transient individuals whose movements no one tracked or recorded. A woman could vanish from Kingsbury Run, where drifters and homeless people made temporary camps among the railroad cars, and no one might notice for weeks or months. She could be from another city entirely, having traveled to Cleveland looking for employment or fleeing some other trouble. As autumn deepened and the case grew cold without new leads, the investigators felt the weight of their failure. Somewhere in Cleveland, a killer moved freely, confident in their ability to reduce human beings to anonymous meat. The surgical precision and chemical knowledge suggested someone educated, someone respectable, perhaps someone who moved in circles where no one would ever suspect them of such horrors. The dehumanization was complete. The victim had become an object lesson in human evil, a reminder that beneath the veneer of civilization, some people harbored appetites that could only be satisfied through the total domination and destruction of others. The Lady of the Lake remained unidentified. Her case file stayed open, but inactive. And in the shadows of Cleveland's industrial landscape, the killer surely smiled at their success, already perhaps planning their next victim, refining their technique, perfecting their terrible craft. The first officially recognized victim of what would become one of America's most disturbing serial murder cases had emerged from Lake Erie that September, but she would not be the last. The summer heat of 1936 settled over Cleveland like a shroud, and beneath the sweltering haze, something terrible was taking shape. A pattern was emerging, though the authorities had not yet recognized it for what it was. The discovery of the Lady of the Lake in September of 1934 had been shocking, certainly, but isolated incidents of violence were not uncommon in a city struggling through the Great Depression. The finding of the unidentified man in Kingsbury Run the following year had raised some eyebrows, particularly given the similar method of dismemberment. But even then, it could have been coincidence. Two murders, however disturbing, did not necessarily make a pattern. But when the bodies began appearing with increasing frequency in 1936, when the killer's handiwork became impossible to ignore, Cleveland's law enforcement finally understood they were dealing with something far more sinister than random acts of violence. They had a serial killer in their midst, and he was growing bolder with each passing month. The third official victim, though he would be numbered as such only in retrospect, was discovered on the 23rd of September, 1936. His name was Edward Andrassy, a 28-year-old man known to frequent the seedier establishments around Kingsbury Run. Two young boys, out chasing adventure in the brambles and tall grasses of that desolate ravine, stumbled upon something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The body lay at the bottom of a slope, arranged with what appeared to be deliberate care, naked and drained of blood. The head had been removed with such precision that the coroner would later comment on the skill involved. But what truly distinguished this killing, what elevated it to a new level of horror, was what the killer had done before death. Edward Andrassy had been castrated. The mutilation was surgical, precise, executed with a knowledge of anatomy that suggested more than mere butchery. The medical examiner, Dr. Arthur Pierce, studied the remains with a mixture of professional detachment and growing unease. The decapitation had been performed with confident, sweeping strokes, each cut clean and purposeful. There were hesitation marks absent, no sawing back and forth as might be expected from an amateur with a blade. Whoever did this knew exactly where to cut, how to separate the vertebrae, how to work through muscle and tissue with minimal effort. Pierce had seen bodies before, countless victims of violence, both calculated and spontaneous. But this was different. This spoke to knowledge, to training, to someone who had spent considerable time understanding the human body's construction. The head was found nearby, positioned several feet from the torso, the eyes closed as if in sleep. The body had been completely exsanguinated, every drop of blood drained away, though there was no blood at the scene itself. Wherever Edward Andrassy had died, wherever the killer had performed his terrible work, it was not in Kingsbury Run. The body had been transported there, placed there, left for discovery like a calling card. Just 30 feet away from Andrassy's corpse, the boys found another body. This victim was older, perhaps in his 40s, completely unidentified, and never to be identified despite exhaustive investigation. He too had been decapitated, his head placed near but not attached to his body. He too had been drained of blood. The level of decomposition suggested he had been dead longer than Andrassy, perhaps killed weeks earlier, and stored somewhere before being deposited in the run. Two bodies, discovered together but killed separately, arranged in a ravine like specimens in a collection. Detective Peter Merillo stood at the scene, watching as the police photographers documented every angle, every detail. He was a veteran of the Cleveland Police Department, a man who had worked his share of homicides, but something about this case settled into his bones like a chill that would never quite leave. Merillo was methodical by nature, detail-oriented, the kind of investigator who believed that every crime told a story if you knew how to read it. And this crime was screaming in narrative that Merillo found increasingly disturbing. He watched as the bodies were loaded onto the coroner's wagon, noting the precision of the cuts, the almost clinical presentation of the remains. This was not the work of a man in a rage, not the frenzied attack of passion or anger. This was controlled, deliberate, performed with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before and would do it again. Merillo felt the weight of certainty settling over him. They were dealing with someone exceptional, someone dangerous in ways that transcended ordinary criminality. The investigation into Edward Andrassy's background revealed a man who lived on society's margins. He had been arrested multiple times for various minor offenses, frequented the brothels and gambling houses, associated with other men who existed in Cleveland's criminal underworld. Several witnesses reported seeing him in the company of an older, well-dressed man in the weeks before his death, but descriptions were vague, contradictory, impossible to pin down. The second victim, the unidentified man, remained a cipher despite every investigative avenue pursued. No one claimed him. No missing persons report matched his description. No fingerprints on file corresponded to his prints. The winter passed with no new discoveries, and for a few months, the investigators dared to hope that perhaps the killer had stopped, had moved on, or had himself died. Peter Merillo knew better. He spent those quiet months reviewing the case files, studying the photographs, reading and rereading the medical examiner's reports. He began compiling notes, creating a profile of the killer based on what the evidence suggested. Medical training or butchering experience, certainly. Someone with access to a private space where bodies could be dismembered without detection. Someone strong enough to transport corpses to various dump sites. someone who moved through the city without attracting suspicion. Then, on February 23, 1937, the killer announced his return in spectacular fashion. A man walking along the shores of Lake Erie, near East 9th Street, noticed something unusual washing up on the beach. At first, he thought it might be part of a mannequin, perhaps discarded refuse from one of the nearby factories. When he realized what he was actually seeing, he ran for the police. It was the lower half of a woman's torso, severed cleanly at the waist, wrapped in burlap, and tied with cord. The legs had been removed at the hips with the same surgical precision that characterized the previous murders. Over the next several days, more pieces of the same woman were discovered scattered across Cleveland's east side. An arm here, another section of torso there, each piece carefully wrapped and deposited in different locations. It was as if the killer was playing a gruesome scavenger hunt, forcing the police to search the entire city for the components of his victim. The head and hands were never found, making identification impossible. The medical examiner estimated she had been in her early 40s, with a muscular build suggesting physical labor. Chemical analysis revealed traces of lime and coal dust on the skin, pointing to possible employment in industrial work. But without fingerprints or dental records, she would remain forever nameless. The newspapers dubbed her Florence Polillo, after police tentatively identified her as a barmaid, an occasional prostitute from the Central Avenue area. Though this identification was never conclusively confirmed, what was certain was the manner of her death. Once again, the killer had taken his time. The dismemberment showed the same expert knowledge of anatomy, the same confident cuts through joints and bone. The body had been drained of blood elsewhere and then sectioned into pieces, each part wrapped with meticulous care before being distributed across the city. Peter Merylo stood in the morgue, staring at the assembled pieces of what had once been a human being, now laid out on multiple examination tables like parts of a puzzle. Dr. Pierce was conducting his examination with grim thoroughness, measuring each cut, documenting every detail. The detective listened as the coroner explained his findings. The cuts were made with a heavy, sharp blade, possibly a butcher's knife or surgical scalpel. The killer demonstrated knowledge of human musculature and skeletal structure. The dismemberment had been performed post-mortem, likely hours after death, suggesting the killer had kept the body for some time before beginning his work. The obsession was setting in now. Merylo could feel it taking root in his mind. He began working the case to the exclusion of almost everything else, spending long hours walking the streets of Kingsbury Run, interviewing residents, talking to the homeless men who sheltered in the shanties that dotted the ravine. He investigated slaughterhouses, questioned butchers, visited medical schools and hospitals, searching for someone with the skills and disposition to commit these crimes. The killer had to be someone, had to exist in the city's fabric somewhere, moving among the population with his terrible secret. In June of 1937, the killer struck again. A teenage boy hunting for discarded scrap metal beneath the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge discovered a skeleton wrapped in newspaper, the skull detached and placed beside the ribcage. The bones had been picked clean, suggesting they had lain somewhere exposed to scavengers before being moved to this location. The newspapers were dated from the previous year, helping to establish a timeline. This was victim number 5, another unidentified male, his head removed with the same precision that now served as the killer's signature. Just 3 weeks later, on July 6, 1937, a man floating in the Cuyahoga River drew the attention of workers at a nearby dock. When they pulled the remains from the water, they found only the torso and partial legs of a man, the head and arms removed. The level of skill evident in the dismemberment left no doubt that this was the same killer. Victim number 6 joined the growing roster of the dead, another anonymous soul claimed by Cleveland's phantom butcher. Peter Merylo stood on the riverbank that day, watching as the remains were fished from the polluted water, and felt the full weight of his failure pressing down upon him. 6 victims now, 6 human beings reduced to pieces and scattered across the city like refuse. And he was no closer to identifying the killer than he had been when Edward Andrassy was found in Kingsbury Run. The pattern was clear, unmistakable. The escalation was evident. The killer was growing more confident, more prolific, more willing to take risks. The detective began to develop a theory, one that would guide his investigation for years to come. The killer had medical training or extensive experience with butchering. He likely worked in a profession that gave him access to sharp instruments and private space. He probably appeared normal, even respectable, someone who could move through society without arousing suspicion. He selected victims from the margins, people whose disappearances would go unnoticed, whose deaths would generate minimal investigation. And most chillingly of all, he showed no signs of stopping. In the morgue, the examination tables now held the remains of 6 different victims, some reduced to mere fragments, others more complete but no less violated. Dr. Pierce had compiled extensive notes on the killer's methods, and he shared Murillo's conviction that they were dealing with someone who possessed genuine expertise. The cuts were too clean, too confident, too knowledgeable to be the work of an amateur. This was someone who understood anatomy at a fundamental level, someone who had studied or worked with human or animal bodies extensively. The city of Cleveland, meanwhile, was beginning to take notice. The newspapers ran increasingly sensational headlines, calling the unknown murderer the Mad Butcher, the Torso Killer, Cleveland's Jack the Ripper. Fear spread through the neighborhoods surrounding Kingsbury Run, and the homeless population that sheltered in those shanties began to dwindle as people sought safety elsewhere. Parents kept their children close. Women walked in groups, and still the bodies appeared, each new victim adding to the growing certainty that Cleveland harbored a monster unlike any it had seen before. The morning of August 19, 1938, started like any other stifling summer day in Cleveland, but for Eliot Ness, it would mark the beginning of his most profound professional humiliation. The man who had brought down Al Capone, whose name appeared in newspapers from coast to coast as America's most celebrated crime fighter, stood at the edge of a dump site on the east side, staring at what remained of 2 more human beings. The bodies, or what was left of them, had been discovered beneath the Lorraine and Carnegie Bridge, wrapped in newspaper and discarded like refuse. The killer had struck again, and Ness knew with a sinking certainty that he was no closer to stopping him than he had been 2 years earlier when he first took on this case. Ness had arrived in Cleveland in December of 1935 with a reputation that preceded him like thunder. The youngest safety director in the city's history, only 33 years old, he came armed with the mystique of the Untouchables, that elite squad of federal agents who had dismantled Capone's bootlegging empire in Chicago. The newspapers loved him. Photographers followed him through the streets. He was handsome, articulate, and represented everything the public wanted to believe about law enforcement during an era when corruption seemed to infect every level of government. Cleveland's new mayor, Harold Burton, had recruited Ness specifically to clean up the police department and restore faith in the city's institutions. It was supposed to be a triumph, another chapter in the legend of America's greatest detective. But the torso murderer was not a bootlegger. He could not be caught with ledgers and bank records. He did not have a network of informants who might betray him for the right price. He left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no evidence that traditional investigative methods could leverage into an arrest. He was a ghost who materialized only through the scattered pieces of his victims, and he was making Eliot Ness look like an ordinary fumbling bureaucrat. By the summer of 1938, the political pressure had become suffocating. Cleveland had hosted the Great Lakes Exposition in 1936 and 1937, massive events designed to showcase the city's recovery from the Depression and its bright industrial future. Millions of visitors had come, and while they marveled at the exhibits and attractions, they also read about the bodies turning up in Kingsbury Run. The national press began referring to Cleveland as the murder capital of America. Real estate values plummeted in certain neighborhoods. Families who could afford to leave did so. The city's carefully cultivated image as a modern, safe metropolis was crumbling with each new discovery. Mayor Burton, who had staked his political future on Ness's appointment, began calling the safety director's office with increasing frequency. The conversations grew tenser, the mayor's patience visibly fraying. City council members publicly questioned whether Ness was out of his depth. Editorial cartoons depicted him chasing shadows while body parts piled up in the background. The man who had faced down Capone's enforcers without flinching found himself paralyzed by an opponent he could not even identify, let alone confront. Ness threw everything he had at the case. He reorganized the investigation multiple times, bringing in fresh detectives, consulting with experts from other cities, even reaching out to federal contacts who owed him favors from his Chicago days. He studied every crime scene photograph until he could close his eyes and see them in perfect detail. He read and reread witness statements, Autopsy reports, evidence logs, searching for the pattern that would unlock everything. He drove through Kingsbury Run at all hours, trying to understand the geography, the rhythms of the neighborhood, the psychology of someone who would choose this particular dumping ground again and again. His traditional methods, the techniques that had made him famous, proved utterly useless. He could not wiretap the killer's phone because he did not know who the killer was. He could not flip an associate because the killer appeared to work entirely alone. He could not follow the money because there was no financial motive apparent in these crimes. The bootleggers he had chased were businessmen at heart, motivated by profit and vulnerable through their greed. This killer seemed to murder for reasons that existed entirely within his own mind, a closed system that Ness could not penetrate. The two bodies discovered in August pushed Ness past the breaking point. They were the 12th and 13th confirmed victims, though some investigators believed the actual count was higher. The killer had been active for at least 4 years, possibly longer, and showed no signs of stopping. If anything, he seemed to be growing bolder, more confident. Some of the recent dumps had been in more visible locations, as if the killer was taunting the police, daring them to catch him. In his desperation, Ness began to focus on a theory that had been forming in his mind for months. The precision of the dismemberments suggested medical knowledge. Several doctors and medical students had been questioned early in the investigation, but one name kept surfacing in Ness's thought. A doctor who had lived near Kingsbury Run, whose office was within walking distance of multiple dump sites, whose personal life suggested someone capable of operating outside normal moral boundaries. Dr. Francis Sweeney was a fascinating and tragic figure. He came from a prominent Cleveland family, had served in World War I, and by all accounts had been a skilled physician. But alcoholism and the dissolution of his marriage had sent him into a downward spiral. He had spent time in veterans' hospitals, receiving treatment for what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. He drank heavily, sometimes disappearing for days at a time. Former colleagues described him as brilliant but increasingly erratic. Neighbors reported strange smells coming from his property and odd hours of activity. Most intriguingly, Sweeney's cousin was Martin Sweeney, a Democratic congressman and fierce political opponent of Mayor Burton. The family connections created a minefield of political complications that made any official investigation extraordinarily delicate. Ness knew that if he pursued Francis Sweeney without ironclad evidence, the political blowback could destroy not just his own career, but also potentially hand ammunition to the mayor's enemies. Despite these obstacles, Ness became increasingly convinced that Sweeney was his man. He ordered surveillance on the doctor, pulling detectives off other assignments to maintain around-the-clock observation. Officers watched Sweeney's comings and goings, documented his visits to bars and flop houses, tracked his movements through the city. They found a man whose life was a shambles, who often appeared intoxicated, who had access to medical instruments and knowledge of human anatomy. But they found nothing that directly connected him to the murders. Ness personally interrogated Sweeney multiple times, bringing him in for questioning sessions that sometimes lasted for hours. The doctor was intelligent and evasive, answering questions with questions, deflecting inquiries with alcoholic rambling that might have been genuine confusion or might have been calculated performance. Ness pushed harder, using interrogation techniques that skirted the edges of what was legally permissible. He wanted a confession, needed one, but Sweeney gave him nothing he could use. In one particularly intense session, Ness arranged for Sweeney to take a lie detector test, a relatively new technology that the safety director hoped might provide the breakthrough he desperately needed. The results were inconclusive, complicated by Sweeney's intoxication and the primitive nature of the equipment. Some detectives interpreted the readings as indicating deception, while others argued they showed only that Sweeney was nervous and drunk. Without a clear confession or physical evidence, the lie detector results were legally worthless. The frustration ate at Ness like acid. He was certain he had identified the killer, could feel it in his bones with the same instinct that had guided him through the Capone investigation. But certainty was not evidence, and evidence was what he lacked. He could not search Sweeney's property without probable cause that would satisfy a judge. He could not arrest him based on suspicion and proximity to crime scenes. The very legal protections that Ness had spent his career upholding now seemed like obstacles protecting a monster. As summer turned to fall in 1938, Ness made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If he could not solve the case through traditional means, if he could not bring the killer to trial and restore his reputation through a successful prosecution, then he would end the murders through other methods. It was a surrender to desperation, an acknowledgement that his famous techniques had failed, and it would come at a terrible cost to everything he had believed about law and justice. The fires began at dusk on a warm August evening in 1938, just as the first drops of rain started to fall over Kingsbury Run. Eliot Ness had made his decision, and there would be no turning back. For months, the torso killer had haunted Cleveland, leaving dismembered bodies scattered throughout the industrial wasteland that snaked through the heart of the city. 13 known victims, perhaps more, their identities often unknown, their deaths brutal beyond comprehension. The investigation had consumed Ness, transformed him from the confident lawman who had taken down Al Capone into something harder, more desperate. The pressure from the newspapers, from City Hall, from the families of the missing, had become unbearable. And so, on that August night, he ordered a raid that would define his legacy in Cleveland far more than any bootlegger he had ever caught. The shantytown that sprawled through Kingsbury Run had become, in Ness's mind, the hunting ground of a monster. Here, in the makeshift shelters cobbled together from scrap metal and rotting wood, lived the most vulnerable people in Cleveland. The unemployed, the alcoholics, the drifters who had fallen through every crack that the Great Depression had opened in American society. They numbered in the hundreds, these forgotten souls, living without addresses, without families who might report them missing, without anyone who would notice if they simply disappeared one night. It was the perfect hunting ground, and Ness knew it. The killer chose victims who existed on the margins, people whose absences created barely a ripple. Several of the victims had been identified as residents of the shantytown. Others had surely passed through, seeking shelter or companionship among others who had nowhere else to go. Somewhere in those ramshackle camps, Ness believed, the killer walked freely, selecting his prey with the casual certainty of a predator in a pen. The raid came without warning. Police cruisers surrounded the area at twilight, their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Officers moved through the settlement in coordinated sweeps, rousing residents from their shelters, checking identification when any existed, taking fingerprints, recording what names could be provided. Many of those displaced had no names to give, at least, none they were willing to share. They had been running from something, hiding from someone, or simply trying to disappear into the anonymous mass of the dispossessed. The residents were given no time to gather possessions, no opportunity to salvage what little they owned. Some fought back with words, with curses hurled at the uniformed men who pulled them from their homes. Others went quietly, with the defeated posture of people who had long since learned that resistance was futile. Children cried in the arms of parents who could not explain what was happening. Old men stumbled through the mud, clutching bottles that contained their only comfort. And then, as the last residents were cleared from the area, the fires began. Ness had ordered the complete destruction of the shantytown. Every shelter, every shack, every makeshift dwelling was to be burned to the ground. The official explanation was sanitation, public health, the elimination of fire hazards and disease. But everyone knew the truth. This was about the torso killer. This was about denying him his hunting ground, about destroying the ecosystem in which he thrived. The flames rose high into the darkening sky, fed by dry wood and the accumulated debris of desperate lives. Mattresses stuffed with newspaper ignited like kindling. Walls of corrugated metal buckled and twisted in the heat. Personal belongings, the small treasures that mean everything when you have nothing, burned without discrimination. A child's doll, its porcelain face cracking in the flames. A photograph in a tin frame, the faces of loved ones lost to curling smoke. A Bible, its pages blackening and lifting like dark birds into the night sky. The rain intensified as the fires burned, creating a surreal landscape of steam and smoke, of orange flames reflected in standing puddles, of shadows dancing against the backdrop of Cleveland's industrial skyline. Officers stood in the downpour, ensuring that every structure was consumed, that nothing remained but ash and memory. The firelight could be seen from downtown, a glow on the horizon that drew crowds to windows and rooftops. Some watched with satisfaction, believing that decisive action was finally being taken against the killer who had terrorized their city. Others watched with unease, recognizing that hundreds of human beings had just been rendered homeless with nowhere to turn, no plan for their survival beyond scattering them to the winds. By midnight, the rain had become a steady downpour, hissing against the smoldering ruins, turning ash to mud. The shantytown that had housed hundreds now existed only as blackened scars on the earth, puddles reflecting the dying embers like pools of blood. The displaced residents had vanished into the night, some taken to temporary shelters, others simply melting away into other hidden corners of the city, places where police would not think to look. Ness watched the fires burn from his car, rain streaming down the windshield. He chain-smoked cigarettes and said little to the officers who approached with reports. What was there to say? He had made a choice that he believed might save lives, but the cost of that choice was visible in every flame, audible in every displaced person's cry of protest and confusion. The moral calculus was brutal in its simplicity. If the killer used the shantytown as his hunting ground, then eliminating the shantytown might save potential victims. But those potential victims were the same people who now had no shelter, who would spend this rainy night, and countless others exposed to the elements, vulnerable to disease, to violence, to all the dangers that had led them to seek refuge in Kingsbury Run in the first place. Ness had destroyed their homes to save their lives, and the paradox of this action would haunt him for the rest of his days. In the weeks and months that followed, the murders appeared to stop. No new torsos were discovered in Kingsbury Run. No dismembered bodies turned up in the usual locations. The silence was profound, unsettling in its own way. Had the raid worked? Had the killer been among those displaced, his hunting ground destroyed, forcing him to move on, or cease his activities? Or was it simply coincidence, the natural end of a killing spree that had run its course? Serial killers do not always continue indefinitely. They die. They are imprisoned for other crimes. They move to new locations, or sometimes they simply stop, the compulsion that drove them fading or being suppressed. The timing of the raid and the cessation of murders was suggestive, but it proved nothing. Theories proliferated in the years that followed. Some investigators believed the killer had indeed been among the shantytown residents, that he had fled Cleveland when his safe haven was destroyed, perhaps taking his terrible skills to another city. Others thought he might have died, succumbing to the same harsh conditions that claimed so many of the homeless. A few even speculated that he had been arrested for some other crime, sitting in a prison cell somewhere, his true nature unknown to the authorities who held him. Reports began to surface of similar murders in other cities. In Pittsburgh in 1940, a dismembered body was found that bore striking similarities to the Cleveland cases. The precision of the cuts, the complete decapitation, the draining of blood, all echoed the torso killer's methodology. In 1942 and 43, bodies were discovered near railroad tracks in Pennsylvania and Ohio, victims who might have fallen prey to the same hand that had terrorized Cleveland. But none of these cases could be definitively linked. The evidence was circumstantial, the similarities suggestive, but not conclusive. The killer, if indeed he had moved on, had chosen his victims well in Cleveland and continued to do so elsewhere. Transients, drifters, people whose movements were untraceable, whose deaths might never be connected across jurisdictional boundaries. For the hundreds of people displaced from Kingsbury Run, the end of the murders was cold comfort. They scattered throughout Cleveland and beyond, seeking shelter wherever they could find it. Some ended up in other shantytowns, rebuilt in different locations, always temporary, always vulnerable to the next raid. Others found their way to municipal shelters, to missions run by churches, to doorways and alleys where they might sleep unnoticed. A few simply left Cleveland entirely, riding the rails to other cities, other states, carrying with them the memory of that August night when fire and rain had destroyed what little stability they had managed to create. The moral weight of Ness's decision cannot be simplified or resolved. He believed he was protecting the vulnerable by scattering them, removing them from the killer's reach. But in doing so, he inflicted immediate harm, destroyed community, and created suffering that was real and measurable. The theoretical lives saved can never be counted against the concrete misery inflicted. History remembers Eliot Ness as the man who brought down Al Capone, the incorruptible lawman who stood against organized crime. But in Cleveland, His legacy is more complicated. The Shantytown raid stands as a stark reminder that the fight against evil sometimes forces choices that carry their own darkness, that protection and harm can become impossibly entangled. The fires in Kingsbury Run burned for hours that August night, visible for miles, a beacon that announced a turning point in the hunt for the torso killer. Whether that turning point represented success or simply the end of one chapter in a longer, darker story remains unknown. The murder stopped, but the cost of that silence was paid by the most vulnerable, the forgotten people who existed on the margins of society. In the smoldering ruins the next morning, investigators searched for evidence, for any clue that might identify the killer who had prompted such drastic action. They found nothing but the remnants of displaced lives, the ashes of poverty and desperation, the mud-soaked foundations of shelters that would never be rebuilt. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of the shantytown, leaving only scorched earth and unanswered questions. The room was cold and sterile, somewhere deep within Cleveland's downtown district. Behind a two-way mirror, Eliot Ness stood motionless in the darkness, watching a man strapped to a chair on the other side of the glass. The year was 1938, and America's most famous lawman believed he was finally face to face with the torso killer, even if that face couldn't see him looking back. The man in the chair was Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney, and what happened in that room over the course of several days would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. Francis Sweeney wasn't supposed to be there. He came from one of Cleveland's most distinguished families, the kind that had buildings and streets named after them. His cousin was Congressman Martin L. Sweeney, a powerful political figure who sat on influential committees and commanded respect throughout Ohio. Francis himself had once been a rising star in the medical community, a gifted surgeon with steady hands and a brilliant mind. But that was before the war, before the alcohol, before something inside him twisted and broke in ways that even his medical training couldn't diagnose or repair. Dr. Sweeney had served in World War I as a military physician. He'd seen things in the field hospitals of France that most people couldn't imagine and wouldn't want to. Young men blown apart by artillery, their bodies reduced to fragments that still somehow breathed and screamed. Limbs stacked like cordwood outside surgical tents. Gas attack victims drowning in their own lungs, clawing at their throats, while doctors could do nothing but watch. Sweeney had tried to put those men back together, working through exhaustion and horror, making impossible decisions about who might live and who was already gone. When he came home to Cleveland, he brought those images with him, carried them behind his eyes where no one else could see. The drinking started as medicine, the way it often does. A few glasses to quiet the nightmares, to smooth the rough edges of memory, to make his hands stop shaking long enough to get through the day. But alcohol is a patient predator. What begins as relief becomes requirement, and requirement becomes compulsion. By the early 1930s, Francis Sweeney's promising medical career was unraveling. His hands, once so precise with a scalpel, now trembled without whiskey to steady them. His marriage collapsed. He moved from his comfortable home into shabby, rooming houses in the seedier parts of Cleveland, the same neighborhoods where the torso killer hunted. What made Eliot Ness focus on Sweeney? The connection wasn't random. Ness had been building a profile of the killer, working with the limited tools of 1930s criminal psychology. The killer clearly had anatomical knowledge. The dismemberments were too precise, too skilled to be the work of someone without medical or butchering experience. The cuts went through joints, avoiding bone when possible, showing an understanding of human anatomy that suggested professional training. Sweeney was a surgeon who had literally spent years cutting people apart and reassembling them. The killer operated in a specific geographic area, primarily around Kingsbury Run and the East Side neighborhoods. Sweeney lived right in the heart of this killing zone, moving between rundown boarding houses and spending his days drinking in the same bars where desperate people went searching for company or spare change. He was a shadow among shadows, an educated man who had descended into Cleveland's underworld. But what really drew Ness's attention was more personal and more disturbing. Sweeney knew Ness. They had met socially before, in better days when Sweeney was still respectable and Ness was the celebrated gangbuster. According to some accounts, there was tension between them even then. After Ness, began investigating the Torso murders, he reportedly received letters, taunting and strange, written by someone who seemed to know details about the investigation that hadn't been released to the public. The handwriting and tone suggested education. The content suggested madness. Ness became convinced that Sweeney was his man, but convincing the prosecutor's office was another matter entirely. There was no physical evidence. No witnesses had identified Sweeney. No bodies had been found in any location connected to him. What Ness had was suspicion, profile matching, and instinct. So he did something that existed in a legal and ethical gray area, even by 1930s standards. He arranged for Sweeney to be picked up and brought in for questioning, not officially arrested, but not exactly free to leave either. The interrogation lasted for days. Ness brought in alienists, the psychiatrists of that era, and he brought in something else, scopolamine, commonly known as truth serum. The use of drugs to compel testimony was experimental and controversial. Scopolamine, derived from nightshade plants, was believed to make lying difficult or impossible. It also caused confusion, hallucinations, and memory problems. What happened in that interrogation room depends largely on whose account you believe and what records you trust. According to later testimony from law enforcement officials who were present, Francis Sweeney confessed. Under the influence of scopolamine, questioned for hours upon hours with Ness, watching silently from behind the glass, Sweeney allegedly admitted to killing people. But the confession was fragmented and disturbing in its particular details. Sweeney spoke of blackouts, extended periods where he couldn't account for his time. He described waking with blood on his clothes that he couldn't explain. He talked about rage that came over him like a red fog, impulses toward violence that terrified even him when he was sober enough to contemplate them. The most chilling detail, the one that has echoed through the decades in true crime circles, is what happened with the polygraph examinations. Lie detector tests were cutting-edge technology in 1938, viewed with an almost mystical faith by some law enforcement agencies. Sweeney was administered multiple polygraph examinations during his interrogation. According to the official accounts, he passed them. The machines registered no deception when he denied killing anyone. But almost simultaneously, under the influence of truth serum, he was describing murders in ways that suggested intimate knowledge. He was, by all accounts, both passing the tests and confessing to the crimes at the same time. How could this be possible? Some believed it revealed the fracture in Sweeney's mind. If he genuinely couldn't remember committing the murders, if they occurred during alcoholic blackouts or dissociative fugue states, then perhaps he honestly believed he hadn't done them even while another part of his consciousness knew the truth. Others saw it as evidence that the whole interrogation was compromised, that mixing truth serum with polygraph testing created unreliable results that couldn't be trusted for either conviction or exoneration. The human mind, under the influence of powerful drugs, doesn't necessarily tell clean truths. Eliot Ness stood behind that glass, watching this broken man contradict himself, confess and deny in the same breath, and faced an impossible choice. He believed Sweeney was the killer, believed it deeply enough to stake his reputation on it. But belief isn't evidence, and what they had obtained in that room could never be used in court. The interrogation methods were questionable at best and illegal at worst. Any confession obtained under drugs would be immediately thrown out. The polygraph results were contradictory and inadmissible anyway. There were no witnesses, no physical evidence, nothing that could survive cross-examination by a competent defense attorney. And then there was the Sweeney family's political power. Congressman Martin Sweeney was not a man to be trifled with. He had already clashed with Ness over political matters, opposing some of the safety director's initiatives in city government. The idea of arresting his cousin, a war veteran and former physician, on charges of being the Torso killer based solely on a drug-induced interrogation would create a political firestorm. It would destroy Ness's effectiveness and likely end his career. The congressman could bring pressure to bear that would make prosecution impossible. After days of interrogation, Francis Sweeney was released. Not cleared, but released. There was no arrest, no formal charges, no public acknowledgement that he had even been questioned. It was as if the entire interrogation had never happened. But something had fundamentally changed. Within days of his release, Francis Edward Sweeney committed himself to the Sandusky Soldiers and Sailors Home, a veterans psychiatric facility about 60 miles from Cleveland. He walked in voluntarily and became a patient in the psychiatric ward. The timing was not coincidental. On the exact day that Sweeney entered the facility, August 18, 1938, Eliot Ness ordered a raid on the shantytown in Kingsbury Run. Dozens of shacks were burned to the ground. Hundreds of homeless people were driven from their makeshift shelters. Ness claimed it was a public safety measure, cleaning up the area where the killer had hunted. But many saw it as an act of frustration and defeat, a violent gesture of a man who couldn't catch the monster, so he destroyed the monster's hunting ground instead. And after August 1938, the torso murders stopped. There were no more decapitated, dismembered bodies found in Cleveland. The killing spree that had terrorized the city for 4 years simply ended. If Francis Sweeney was the killer, then his self-commitment to a locked psychiatric facility had accomplished what Cleveland's entire police force could not. It had stopped him. But Francis Sweeney had one more act of cruelty to perform. From his room in the Veterans Hospital, he allegedly began sending postcards to Eliot Ness. The cards came intermittently over years, sometimes months apart, sometimes in clusters. They were never directly threatening and never contained explicit confessions. But they were disturbing in their tone and timing. Some were signed with variations of Sweeney's name. Others were anonymous, but in handwriting that experts believed matched Sweeney's. They contained inside jokes and references that suggested the writer knew Ness personally. They arrived on significant dates, anniversaries of murders or of Ness's public failures. The postcards were a form of psychological torture. They said, "I'm here. You know who I am, you know what I did, and you can't touch me." They were the killer's final victory, if indeed Sweeney was the killer. Ness kept the postcards, but could do nothing with them. What were they proof of? A disturbed man's need for attention? A guilty conscience seeking acknowledgement? Or simply the continuation of a cat and mouse game between two men bound together by unsolved murders? Eliot Ness would leave Cleveland in 1942, his reputation tarnished by the failure to solve the torso murders and by various political and personal scandals. He would spend the rest of his life drinking too much and talking about his glory days fighting Al Capone in Chicago. He died in 1957, just before the publication of the book, The Untouchables, that would make him famous again. He died still believing that Francis Sweeney was the torso killer and died frustrated that he could never prove it. Francis Edward Sweeney remained in psychiatric facilities for most of the rest of his life. He died in 1964 in a veterans hospital in Dayton, Ohio. He was never charged with any crime. His death certificate listed no occupation, no accomplishments, just a name and dates. Whether he was the torso killer or simply a convenient suspect, a broken man used by Ness to create closure where none existed, remains unknown. The evidence points in troubling directions but proves nothing definitively. The postcards still exist in archives, silent and ambiguous. This is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the torso murders. We came so close to knowing. That interrogation room, that man in the chair, those days of questioning, represented the nearest approach to truth that the investigation would ever achieve. And it wasn't close enough. The answer may have been right there behind that glass, confessing and denying simultaneously, broken by war and alcohol, and perhaps by the weight of terrible crimes. Or perhaps Eliot Ness was watching the wrong man entirely, imposing a solution on chaos because the human mind cannot tolerate uncertainty. We'll never know which possibility is more disturbing. We return now to where we began, to that strange digital campfire where millions gather each night. In the blue glow of their screens, they search for rain sounds, thunder sounds, sounds to help them sleep. And there, among the tropical storms and April showers, they find Kingsbury Run. They click play. The rain begins to fall, and a voice tells them about severed heads and dismembered torsos, about a killer who was never caught, about bodies found in the mud. And then somehow, impossibly, they close their eyes and drift away. This is the paradox we must sit with. We live in an age of ambient anxiety, where nameless threats scroll past us every waking hour. Climate catastrophe, political chaos, economic uncertainty, all of it too vast to hold, too complex to comprehend. We are haunted by everything and nothing at once. And so we have learned to seek comfort in a different kind of horror. We choose our monsters carefully now. We pick the ones with names, with stories, with boundaries. The torso killer stalked Kingsbury Run from 1935 to 1938. He killed at least 12 people, perhaps more. He was never identified. He was never stopped. These facts are terrible, yes, but they are facts. They have edges. They have limits. They exist in the past tense. True crime has become our unexpected meditation, our lullaby, our prayer. We seek the comfort of knowable evil in a world drowning in unknowable dread. There is something almost soothing about listening to a mystery that has already happened, that cannot reach through time to harm us, that exists safely on the other side of history. But here is what we must acknowledge, what we must carry with us. Some things remain unknowable. The exact number of victims may never be confirmed. The killer's true identity died with him, if he ever lived at all. Whether justice was achieved in some secret way, in some back room or asylum or quiet death, we will never know. And perhaps, in our honest moments, we must admit that we do not truly want to know. The unanswered question has become more valuable than any answer could be. Today, Kingsbury Run is a bike path. Joggers pass through in the morning light, headphones in their ears, perhaps listening to the very stories that unfolded beneath their feet. The sites where bodies were found remain unmarked, unremarkable, reclaimed by ordinary life. The rain still falls there, just as it always has, and it sounds exactly like the rain that falls everywhere else. And maybe that is the final truth, the one we cannot escape. Some questions are more comforting left unanswered. And the killer's silence, that vast and eternal silence, may be the most terrifying sound of all. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.